please allow me to introduce you to this Perry Ellis Portfolio men's dress shirt. The listed sizes are 16.5 inches and 34-35 inches. It's about to get reinvented into a ladies' shirtwaist based on an 1896 Basque design.
Greetings everyone, welcome back to my workroom at 24 Washington Avenue, where I largely investigate how threads from history can still be applied today. If this is a subject that piques your interest, please do be sure to subscribe to this channel for more. I first drafted a bodice from Basque No. 2 in the Eureka Lady Tailor system back in 2015. It was the first blouse or bodice or shirtwaist that I had ever drafted, and only my second ever attempt at any kind of blouse construction. I knew so little about Victorian cutting methods or garment construction that when it came time to draft that shoulder seam and instead of sloping down the shoulder it went up, I was completely thrown for a loop. Later, of course, I came to understand that the shoulder piece drapes over to the back so that that seam is hidden on the back. But more on that later. The blouse turned out really quite well. Here's one of our Christmas photos from that year. And while I wasn't prepared to go into all of the details of drafting Victorian style sleeves at the time, I was able to construct a very simple sleeve covering which served the purposes just fine. I ended up wearing that blouse many times over the years as my body changed in one direction and the other, but it always fit very well. And when I decided that I wanted to upcycle a men's dress shirt into a full-blown Victorian ladies tailored shirtwaist, I decided that I would use that initial shirt as the foundation mock-up, if you will, for the new shirt. Here's how that story unfolded.
The first thing I needed to do was to make sure that my pattern pieces were going to fit. The shirt was at least a large, I believe, perhaps even an XL. And I generally wear a small to medium, no problem, right? Well, not quite. If the shirt had been cut to a Victorian style, it would have been a lot easier, but with the extra height that goes on the front piece in order to accommodate that over-the-shoulder drape, it was most important to ensure that there was adequate length to even fit the pieces. And then, of course, there's the grain line to consider, more apparent with this fabric because of the actual stripes. When I was pretty sure that I could make it work, I began splitting the hems and seams, even the one behind the buttons. The pieces were ironed, and then I started laying my pattern pieces on top. Truthfully, fitting the pieces was far more of a nightmare than I expected. I ended up having to piece together some extra fabric in order to have enough width for one of the underarm gores. Can you believe that? A large or XL men's shirt and I nearly didn't have enough fabric? It seems laughable. But by using the outer yoke to extend my fabric, I was able to get the pieces laid out with just enough seam allowance. The pattern outlines were chalked and then mark stitched. Now, if you haven't come across this nifty technique, you use threads to mark key parts on 2 layers of fabric at once, using your chalk line as the guide. The layers are then separated slightly, and those marking threads are cut to ensure that the threads remain on both layers and then opened up. And the benefit of this is that if your chalk line gets brushed off, you still have the thread marks, plus you haven't had to re-chalk on the other side or other pattern piece because the thread marks are there. I started by pinning the back pieces together, trying to be very sure not to unduly stretch any of those bias grain cuts and thus skew the lay of the fabric. After pinning and after admiring the beautiful lines that are so indicative of Victorian backs, I realized that I would need to fell that pieced together section before actually sewing the seams together. I cut out my panels and pieced everything together to make the final fitting on my dress form, and suddenly noticed that something was really off. All of the panels were much too high. There was too much fabric at the top of the front, the arm was clearly needing to be lowered, so I took the side on the left here, unpinning everything while it was still on the dress form, and effectively draped it back together so that it would fit correctly. And here I present to you my tale of 2 sides. The fitted one, that really does fit like a glove. When I tried it on, it just lay there. It was really lovely. and then this side that's in need of some serious attention. Clearly, the way to avoid that in the future is going to be marking the joining pieces with notches so that they can easily be reassembled. I should have done that when I took my burgundy mock-up to pieces, but there we go, another lesson learned in my ongoing investigations. I truly enjoyed working on the sleeves. I've only attempted to draft from one other set of instructions, but those in this scientific Lady Tailor system really were so much more thorough. Fitting the pieces on the fabric was once again tricky. Whereas modern sleeves are cut straight, Victorian sleeves are cut making allowance for that natural at-rest bend in the arm. They're not tapered tubes into which your arm fits. Add to that the opening and placket at the base of this sleeve to accommodate the opening and closing of the cuff posed a problem. While I really wanted to keep the grain line true to the indication on my pattern piece, I had to settle for a close to. Oh, the struggles of repurposing fabric. After a lot of deliberation, I realized that there really was no way to avoid that sleeve opening. I decided to remove the placket around it and secure everything in place with a cover made from the interior yoke. Here are the pieces cut, and if you watched my sweat guard dress shield video, you will have seen a very similar shape used there. It's a two-part enclosure. I pressed the curve edge only, as the other edges were to be sewn into the seam. That curved edge was prick-stitched in place with a contrasting thread. I figured that as the pattern was in an opposing direction, I might as well make a point of everything about it. I positioned a self-drafted trial collar, but suddenly wondered if maybe I could get away with reusing the original stabilizer stiffened shirt collar. It had the typical pointed collar of modern times, which wasn't going to work for the look I wanted, but because of the way that the tips extended, I figured that I should be able to redo those edges to fit the shape of the standing collar that I wanted. Here's the collar pinned along the top edge of my shirtwaist, and you can see that I used pins to mark the targeted collar outline before doing more seam ripping and resewing that edge. I then repositioned the collar and marked where the edge of my shirt reached before sewing that in place. As to the cuffs, I decided to reuse the ones from the original shirt. They were going to be considerably smaller, of course, but I figured that rather than redoing buttons and buttonholes and openings, I'd simply leave the cuff fixed at a size through which my hand could pass. The drafting instructions had you take the wrist measure from around your hand so that it could be slipped on and off, which would suggest that it was to be fixed rather than opening and closing with buttons or hooks. I finished the edges of the sleeve and then secured the cuffs in place by hand. Moving on to the front closure. I didn't have enough excess fabric at the front center to fold the edges over, so I used a separate piece of white fabric and a strip of stabilizer. Both were cut to the curve of the center front. I sewed the fabric edges together, pressed, and then turned the seam so that the outer fabric would actually form the outer edge, making the backing less visible. I pinned right up against that outer edge and then used steam from my iron to set the crease. I did not move the iron over those pins. I then folded the other edge of the backing piece to form a casing over the stabilizer and pinned the back layer and stabilizer together. I decided to try hook and eye closures. I had never used that as my primary closure method and figured that I should give it a go. With this in mind, I did not pin through the face fabric as I did not wish to have thread marks visible from sewing the hooks in place. The plan was to sew the hooks to that back piece and stabilized layer, and then secure that stabilized back piece to the face fabric by hand. I used pins to mark the points of the most strain across the bust so that I could be sure to put closures at those locations, and then distributed the positions for other hooks as evenly as I could. I basted the hooks and eyes in place after making sure that I had marked which side was which, and when I was happy that the fit was correct, I secured them in place. As planned, I whip-stitched the edge down, which resulted in a very uninterrupted front closure. The remaining seams on the inside were also whip-stitched. And finally, I was able to debut my shirtwaist with a lovely walk to the park on a very, very hot day. With my dress shields pinned in place, I was delighted to return home to find no trace of sweat marks under my arms. Hurrah for being discreet!